My younger brother stood up in a courtroom and told a judge that I had lost my mind, and he brought a doctor to prove it, and for about 10 seconds, watching the faces in that room begin to believe him, I understood the single most terrifying thing a sane man can ever learn, which is how astonishingly easy it is to convince the world that you are not. There is nothing you can do, in that moment, that does not make it worse. If you stay calm, you are unnaturally calm, cold, detached, a sign. If you show emotion, you are agitated, unstable, exactly as described. If you defend yourself well, you are cunning, and the cunning is itself suspicious in a man they've been told is failing. My brother Douglas had built a beautiful trap, a trap with no exit because the trap was my own mind, and he had spent a year quietly convincing everyone who mattered that it was crumbling. And now he stood in a courtroom asking a judge to give him control of my life, my decisions, my money, my freedom, on the grounds that I could no longer be trusted with any of it. Stay with me, because what my brother did not know, as he stood there so sorrowfully explaining to the court that his poor declining brother needed to be protected from himself, was that I had seen this coming for a year, that I was sharper than I had ever been in my life, and that I had spent that year building, quietly, patiently, the one thing that can destroy a false accusation of madness, which is proof. He thought he had walked me into a courtroom to bury me. He had actually walked himself onto a stage I had built, in front of the one audience that could end him, and he had no idea until it was far too late that the sane man was the one holding the trap. My name is Henry Calloway. I am 73 years old, and I promise you, entirely in possession of my mind, which is a strange and terrible thing to have to promise, and I want to tell you the whole of what happened, from my wife's funeral to that courtroom, because I have learned that there is a particular kind of cruelty in this world that almost no one talks about until it happens to them, and then they discover, too late, that it is far more common than anyone admits. It is the cruelty of being declared incapable, of having the people who are supposed to love you decide that the most efficient way to take what you have is not to fight you, because you are strong, but to erase you, to declare that the person making your decisions is no longer really there, and to have a court agree. It happens to the old constantly, quietly, in courtrooms all over this country, and most of the time it happens to people who genuinely need protection, and thank God that protection exists because there are truly vulnerable people who would be preyed upon without it. But sometimes the protective machinery built to shield the vulnerable is turned, deliberately, by someone who knows exactly how to work it, against a person who is not vulnerable at all, and there is almost no crueler weapon on earth because it does not just take your money, it takes your very self, it declares to the world that you are gone while you are standing right there. That is what my brother tried to do to me. And I want to tell you how a sane man fights a war whose entire premise is that he is insane, and wins because if it ever happens to you or someone you love, and I pray it does not, you need to know that it can be survived and how. Let me start where it really started, which was with the death of my wife, because my brother built his entire scheme on the foundation of my grief, and you cannot understand the scheme without understanding the grief. My wife's name was Eleanor, and we were married for 46 years, and she was, in every way that the word can mean, my home. Let me tell you one thing about Eleanor, so you understand what I lost and why the loss left me so open to what Douglas did. Eleanor and I met when we were young and had nothing, and we built everything together, the business, the life, the marriage, and the way we did it was that Eleanor was the one who saw people clearly. I was the builder, the worker, the one with the head for the business, but Eleanor had a gift I never had, which was that she could look at a person and know almost instantly what they truly were underneath what they presented, and for 46 years she was my early warning system, the one who would say quietly after some dinner, "Henry, be careful with that man, he is not what he seems," and she was never once wrong. And I have thought many times that if Eleanor had been alive, Douglas would never have dared, because Eleanor would have seen it in him the first week, would have caught the calculation behind the sudden concern before I ever could, and would have shut it down with a single look across a room. Douglas waited until Eleanor was gone. I do not think that was an accident. I think, on some level, my brother understood that as long as Eleanor lived, there was someone standing beside me who could see him clearly, and that only with her gone was I finally, truly vulnerable, a man who had spent 46 years relying on his wife to read the room, suddenly alone and grief-blind and easy to work on. So when I tell you that Eleanor was my home, I mean it in that way too, that she was my protection, my clarity, the eyes that saw what I missed, and that losing her did not just break my heart. It took down the wall that had guarded me my whole adult life, and Douglas walked straight through the gap where she had stood. That is the cruelty layered inside the cruelty, that my brother used the absence of the one person who loved us both as the very opening for his scheme, that he could only erase me once the woman who would have defended me was in the ground. When Eleanor died 14 months before that courtroom, after a long illness that I nursed her through to the very end, I was destroyed in the specific way that only the loss of a decades-long marriage can destroy a person, which is that I did not just lose Eleanor, I lost the entire context of myself, the person I had been for 46 years, the we that I had become so completely that I no longer quite knew how to be an I. And in the months after her death, I grieved hard, the way you are supposed to grieve, the way a man who loved his wife for 46 years had damn well better grieve. I was sad. I was quiet. Some days I did not want to get out of bed. I forgot things, small things, the way any grieving, exhausted, heartbroken person forgets things, the way anyone forgets things, because forgetting where you put your keys is not dementia, it is being a human being with a mind full of a dead wife. I was, in short, a normal man suffering a normal, enormous grief. And my brother Douglas looked at that normal grief, and he saw not a brother to comfort, but an opportunity to exploit, and he began, very quietly, to build a case. I need to tell you about Douglas, because the betrayal does not land unless you understand who he was to me. Douglas is my younger brother by 5 years, and I had, our whole lives, been the steady one, the successful one, the one who looked after him. I built a business, a good one, a distribution company that I grew over 30 years and sold. Finally, for enough that Eleanor and I never had to worry, and Douglas, my brother, never quite found his footing the way I did. I mention the business not to boast, but because it matters to how this story went. Because 30 years of building and running a company teaches you certain things that turned out to be exactly the things I needed. It teaches you patience, the discipline to wait for the right moment instead of the satisfying one. It teaches you to document, to keep records, to understand that in any serious dispute the person with the paper trail wins and the person with only their word loses. It teaches you to read a room, to understand incentives, to ask always the cold clarifying question, who benefits when something does not add up? And above all, it teaches you not to panic, because I had faced ruin more than once in 30 years of business, had stood at the edge of losing everything and learned to keep my head, to think clearly precisely when everything in me wanted to flail, and that skill, the ability to be calm and strategic under existential threat, is not a common one, and it is not one Douglas had, and it turned out to be the deciding difference between us. Douglas assumed he was moving against a soft target, a grieving, gentle, retired old man. He did not stop to remember that the gentle, retired old man had spent 30 years in the hard, practical world of building a company from nothing, that under the grief was a mind trained by decades of high-stakes decisions to stay cold and document everything and wait for the right moment. He was not, it turned out, moving against a soft old man at all. He was moving against a retired operator who had simply been quiet for a few years, and who, the moment he understood he was under attack, reached back into 30 years of hard-won instinct and went, quietly, to work. That is a lesson in itself, I think, about underestimating people, about assuming that because someone is old or grieving or gentle, they have lost the steel that built their life. The steel does not leave. It just waits, quiet, until it is needed. He was charming, always, and respectable looking, and he moved through the world with the easy confidence of a man who assumes things will work out. But they often didn't, his ventures, his investments, his schemes, and over the decades I had quietly helped him more times than I could count. A loan here that was never repaid and never mentioned, a bailout there because he was my little brother and that is what you do. I never held it over him. I never kept score. I want to be clear about that because it is the thing that makes what he did so much worse, that he did not do it to a brother who had wronged him. He did it to a brother who had spent a lifetime catching him every time he fell. I remember one time in particular, maybe 20 years ago, when Douglas had gotten himself into trouble with a business partner, a real mess, the kind that could have ended in court and ruin, and he came to me at 2 a.m, ashen, shaking, and I got dressed and I sat with him at my kitchen table until dawn, and then I spent the next month and a good deal of money cleaning it up, making it go away, protecting my little brother from the consequences of his own bad judgment. And at the end of it, Douglas wept and said he didn't deserve me, and I told him what I always told him, that it didn't matter what he deserved, that he was my brother, and that I would always come, no questions asked, no ledger kept, because that is what a brother is for. Eleanor, I remember, was not so sure. Eleanor loved Douglas, but she saw him more clearly than I did. And she said to me once, gently, "Henry, you keep catching him, and a man who is always caught never learns to keep his own feet." And I did not listen, because he was my brother and catching him was simply what I did. I have thought about that a great deal since the courtroom. I have wondered whether Eleanor was right, whether a lifetime of my catching him taught Douglas that there were no consequences, that his big brother's resources were simply there to be drawn on, and whether that lesson, learned over decades, was part of what made him capable, finally, of the ultimate version of it, reaching not for my help this time but for everything I had, through a court by erasing me. I do not know. I do not think it excuses him. A man is responsible for his own soul. But I know that the same brother I sat with until dawn, the same brother I caught every time he fell for 50 years, looked at me in my grief and saw, not the man who had always caught him, but a resource to be seized, and the distance between those two things, between the brother I was to him and the brother he became to me, is a wound that all the vindication in the world has never quite closed. And I would learn, later, that at the time he decided to have me declared incompetent, Douglas was in the worst financial trouble of his life, drowning in debts from a series of catastrophic investments, and that he had looked at his wealthy, grieving, recently widowed older brother, and had done a piece of arithmetic that I will never fully forgive, which was that a brother declared incompetent, with Douglas installed as his guardian, would give Douglas control of everything I had, legally, with the blessing of a court, all of it framed as loving protection. He did not need to wait for me to die. He just needed the world to agree that I was already, in the ways that counted, gone. The scheme was patient and it was clever, and I have to give him that, in the cold way you have to respect a disease that nearly kills you. It started so small that I did not even recognize it as anything at all. Douglas began, in the months after Eleanor's death, to be around more, which at first I was grateful for because I was lonely and grieving, and here was my brother, suddenly attentive, suddenly caring, dropping by, checking on me, taking me to appointments. I thought, how nice, how kind, grief has brought us closer. I did not understand that every visit was reconnaissance, that every kindness was the laying of a foundation, that my brother was not spending time with me because he loved me but because he was building, visit by visit, the position of the concerned, involved, loving younger brother who was so worried about poor Henry, so that when the time came, his concern would have the weight of a year of visible devotion behind it. That is the thing about the truly calculated betrayals. They are indistinguishable in the moment from love. Everything Douglas did to destroy me looked exactly like a brother being kind, and that is precisely why it worked and precisely why it was so monstrous. And then, slowly, the incidents began, and this is the part that I need you to listen to very carefully, because it is the part that nearly broke me, the part that is the true horror at the center of this, worse than any courtroom. Things began to go wrong in my life in small, specific, deeply unsettling ways. I would put something down, my reading glasses, my wallet, a document, and later it would not be where I was certain I had left it, and I would find it somewhere strange, somewhere I would never have put it. I began to miss appointments I had no memory of being told about, and to be reminded of appointments I was sure had been scheduled for a different day. Once I found the burners on my stove left on, though I was certain I had not cooked that day. Bills I knew I had paid turned up unpaid. Small sums of money seemed to go missing. And each time, there was Douglas, so concerned, so gentle, saying, "It's all right, Henry, it happens, don't worry about it." In a voice that carried, underneath the kindness, the clear implication that it was not all right, that it was happening more and more, that we both knew what it meant. And here is the thing I have to confess to you, because it is the cruelest part and I would be lying if I hid it. For a while I believed him. For a while, alone in that house, grieving, exhausted, finding my glasses in the freezer, I began to wonder if I was, in fact, losing my mind. That is what the gaslighting does, and I use that word carefully because that is exactly what it was. When enough strange things happen, and someone you trust keeps gently confirming your worst fear, you begin to doubt the one thing a person cannot afford to doubt, which is your own grip on reality. And I spent some genuinely terrifying weeks lying awake at night wondering if my brother was right, if Eleanor's death had broken something in me, if I was slipping away and simply could not feel it happening. There is no loneliness like that loneliness, the loneliness of doubting your own mind, and my brother engineered it deliberately. And it is the thing I find hardest to forgive, harder even than the money, because he took my grief, the most vulnerable I have ever been, and he used it to make me doubt my own sanity on purpose for money. And he did something else during those months, something I only fully understood later, which was that he isolated me, quietly, systematically, the way a person clears a field before they build on it. I had friends, old friends, people who had known me for decades and would have seen instantly that there was nothing wrong with my mind, and one by one, Douglas came between me and all of them. He would tell them, in that concerned voice, that I was not doing well, that I got confused and tired around people now, that it was probably best not to overwhelm me with visits, that he was managing my care and would let them know when I was up to seeing anyone. And he would tell me that so-and-so had called to cancel, that people were busy, that everyone understood I needed my rest. He was cutting the wires, one at a time, severing me from everyone who could have contradicted his story, so that the only voice consistently in my ear, the only person defining reality for me, was him. And it worked for a while because I was grieving and did not have the energy to question why the phone had gone so quiet, and I did not understand that my brother was building a chamber around me in which his was the only voice, because a lie only survives in isolation, and a man surrounded by people who know him cannot be convinced he is someone other than who he is. That is a signature of this particular cruelty, and I want you to know it because if you ever see it, someone slowly, sweetly cutting a vulnerable person off from everyone who loves them, always with the kindest explanations, always for the person's own good, you are very possibly watching the early construction of exactly the kind of trap that was built around me. Isolation is the tell. Watch for the isolation. There was one night, the worst of them, that I have to tell you about because it is the bottom of the pit I climbed out of, and I think someone listening needs to know that the bottom is survivable. It was perhaps 3 in the morning, and I had woken from a dream of Eleanor and reached for her side of the bed and found it empty. The way I did every night, and in the grief and the dark I started to catalog the strange things that had been happening, the glasses, the appointments, the stove, and I felt the terror rise up in me, the certainty that I was disappearing, that my mind was going, that Douglas was right and I was becoming a danger to myself, a burden, a man who could not be trusted. And I sat up in that dark, empty bed and I put my head in my hands, and for the first time in my adult life I felt something close to despair. The specific despair of a person who believes he is losing the very thing that makes him himself, and who is facing it utterly alone, in the middle of the night, with no one to reach for, because the one person he could always reach for is in the ground, and the brother who should be a comfort is somehow, inexplicably, part of the fear. I want to be honest that it was a very dark night, one of the darkest of my life, and that I understand, having been there, how a person in that state could give up, could simply sign whatever they were told to sign, could accept the erasure because fighting it felt impossible and being managed felt like rest. I understand that now, from the inside, and I want to say to anyone who is in that place tonight, in that 3 in the morning despair of doubting your own mind, that the despair is a lie, or at least it can be, that the very fact that you are frightened and questioning is itself often a sign of a mind still very much working, and that there is a path out, a concrete, practical path, independent evaluation, documentation, clear-eyed people who will tell you the truth, and that you do not have to accept anyone's account of your own mind, least of all the account of someone who benefits from your decline. I climbed out of that pit. It took catching Douglas at a reception desk to do it, but I climbed out, and if you are in it, I need you to believe there is a way out for you too, and that reaching for it is not weakness, it is the bravest and most self-respecting thing a person can do. If you have listened this far, let me stop and ask you the question that lived in me during those terrible weeks, and I ask it gently because I suspect some of you have been made to doubt yourselves by someone you trusted, in one way or another, and I want you to know you are not alone in it. When someone you love, someone whose job is to reflect the truth back to you, instead begins to quietly tell you that you cannot trust your own mind, your own memory, your own perceptions, how long does it take before you believe them? And how do you ever find your way back to solid ground once you've started to doubt the ground itself? Tell me in the comments, because I think this particular cruelty, the deliberate manufacture of self-doubt in a person you're supposed to love, is far more common than we admit in families, in marriages, in workplaces, and I think the people who have survived it need to hear each other say, out loud, that it is real and that you can come back from it. Because I did come back. And I want to tell you the exact moment I did because it changed everything. The moment I came back to myself was the moment I caught the lie. It was a small thing and it was everything. I had a doctor's appointment, an important one, and Douglas had insisted on driving me, as he now always did, and we arrived, and the receptionist looked at her screen with a puzzled frown and said that my appointment was not until the following week, that someone had called and rescheduled it. And Douglas turned to me with that gentle, pitying, worried look and said, "Oh, Henry, did you forget again? Didn't we talk about this?" And in that instant, standing at that reception desk, something cold and clear cut through the fog of grief and self-doubt, because I knew with total certainty that we had not talked about this, that I had not rescheduled anything, that my brother was standing there in front of a witness performing my confusion, and I looked at his face, at the careful concern arranged on it, and for the first time I did not see my worried little brother. I saw a man acting. I saw the performance underneath the performance. And I understood, all at once, in a rush that nearly buckled my knees, that I was not losing my mind at all, that I had never been losing my mind, that every single strange incident of the past months had a much simpler explanation than dementia, which was that someone with a key to my house and constant access to my life was manufacturing them, one by one, on purpose, and then standing beside me looking concerned. My glasses did not walk into the freezer. My appointments did not reschedule themselves. My brother was doing it. And the moment I understood that, the fog lifted completely, because there is nothing like the discovery that you are not crazy to restore a man to the full and furious possession of his mind. I want to describe that feeling, because it was one of the strangest and most powerful of my life. For weeks I had been living inside a slow dissolving, a sense of my own edges blurring, of the ground getting soft under me, and I had been so tired and so sad that I had almost surrendered to it, almost accepted that this was what the end of a life looked like, a gradual sinking into confusion. And then, in the space of a single second at a reception desk, the whole thing reversed, because the instant I understood that the confusion was manufactured, every piece of evidence for my decline transformed, before my eyes, into evidence of my brother's scheme. The glasses in the freezer stopped being proof that I was losing my mind and became proof that someone had put them there. The missed appointments stopped being my failing memory and became someone's phone calls. The whole terrifying picture flipped, like one of those drawings that is a vase until suddenly it is two faces, and once you see the second image you cannot unsee it, and I could not unsee it, and in that flip I went from a frightened, dissolving old man to something else entirely, something cold and clear and, I will admit, dangerous, because a man who has been made to doubt his own sanity and then discovers he was right all along does not come back mild. He comes back with a clarity and a resolve that a comfortable man never has, because he has been to the edge of losing his own self and has clawed back, and he knows now, in his bones, exactly what is being threatened and exactly what it is worth. I walked out of that doctor's office a different man than I had walked in, and my brother, chatting beside me so pleasantly about being more careful, had no idea that the confused old target he thought he was managing had just silently become the most dangerous adversary of his life. I did not confront him. That is the single most important decision I made in this entire story, and I want to explain why, because every instinct screamed at me to turn to him right there at that reception desk and say, I know what you're doing, I know it's you, and it took everything I had not to. But some old, cold businessman's part of me, the part that had built and sold a company and knew how the world actually works, understood in that moment that if I confronted Douglas, I would gain the momentary satisfaction of watching his face, and I would lose the war because I would have warned him, and a warned enemy adjusts, gets more careful, covers his tracks. And I understood something else, something crucial about the specific nature of this particular attack, which is that if my brother was manufacturing evidence of my incompetence, then he was building towards something, some formal proceeding, someday in a court, and that a proceeding like that is not won by protesting your sanity, because protesting your sanity is exactly what an insane person does. It is won by proof. Cold, documented, unimpeachable, third-party proof. And I realized, standing at that desk while my brother performed my decline, that I was in a war whose entire premise was that I could not be trusted, and that the only way to win a war like that was to become, quietly, the most thoroughly documented sane man in the history of the world, and to let my brother keep building his case, keep committing himself, keep believing I was fading, right up until the day I walked into his courtroom and detonated a year of proof under his feet. So I smiled at Douglas, at that reception desk, and I said, You're right. I must have forgotten. Thank you for looking after me. And I watched a flicker of satisfaction cross his face, and I understood that I had just made the most important move of the entire war, which was to let my brother believe he was winning. Because a man who thinks he is winning gets careless, and a careless enemy documents his own crime, and I intended to be there, sane and ready, to collect every careless piece of it. Let me tell you what I did over the year that followed, because it is the whole of how a sane man defeats an accusation of madness, and it is the thing I most want you to carry in case you ever need it. The first thing I did was the most important, and it is the thing almost no one thinks to do, because when you are being told you are losing your mind, the instinct is to argue, to insist, to protest. But you cannot argue your way out of an accusation of incompetence, because the argument itself gets used against you. So I did not argue. Instead, quietly, without telling Douglas or anyone connected to him, I went and got proof. I made an appointment on my own with the most respected neuropsychologist in the region, a woman named Dr. Ellen Nakamura, whose evaluations were considered the gold standard, the kind of testing that courts trust absolutely, and I sat for the full battery, hours of it, the cognitive tests, the memory tests, the reasoning tests, everything, And I did it not once but 3 times over the course of that year, at intervals creating a documented, dated, longitudinal record from an unimpeachable, independent expert, establishing that my cognition was not merely normal but, in Dr. Nakamura's words, exceptional for a man of my age, in the top percentiles, sharper than most people half my age. I want you to understand what that record was. It was a wall. It was a wall that Douglas did not know existed, being built quietly behind him while he built his little house of manufactured incidents. And it was a wall that no compliant doctor and no sad story about a grieving widower could ever get past, because it was not opinion, it was data, gathered by the most credible source available, and it was the single most powerful thing I did, and I did it first, before anything else, because everything else depended on it. I remember sitting for the first of those evaluations, and I remember the strange mix of feelings because there was a small, cold fear underneath it, the fear that had been planted in me during the gaslighting weeks, the fear that maybe I would fail, maybe Douglas was right, maybe the tests would show something and I really was slipping. That fear is the poison the gaslighting leaves in you, and it does not fully wash out just because you've caught the liar. So I sat for hours of testing with that small fear in my chest, and I want to tell you the relief, the enormous weeping relief, when Dr. Nakamura sat me down afterward and told me, in her calm professional way, that not only was there no sign whatsoever of any impairment, but that my cognition was, in her words, remarkable, that I had performed in the top percentiles across every domain, that she rarely saw a mind as sharp as mine in a man of 73. I did not know, until she said it, how badly I had needed to hear it, how much of Douglas's poison was still in me, and I sat in that office, a grown man, a man who had built and sold a company, and I put my face in my hands and I wept out of pure relief because my brother had made me doubt the one thing no person should ever have to doubt, and a good and honest doctor had just handed it back to me, certified, unimpeachable, mine. That is what the truth does when you finally get an honest, independent measure of it. It does not just win your case. It gives you back yourself. And I want anyone who has ever been made to doubt their own mind to hear this, that seeking out an honest, independent, credible assessment is not an admission that your tormentor might be right. It is the way you take back the certainty they stole, and there is no shame in it, only strength, and on the far side of it there is a relief you cannot imagine until you feel it. The second thing I did was begin to document the manufacture. Now that I knew the incidents were being staged, I could catch them being staged, and I did. I started keeping a private journal, dated and detailed, recording every strange occurrence, exactly where I had left an item and exactly where it was later found, every appointment discrepancy, every missing sum, building a record that showed not the chaos of a failing mind but the unmistakable pattern of a hand at work. And I did one more thing, a thing I want to note was entirely legal, which is that in my own home, which I owned, I placed a few small recording devices, the kind anyone can buy, because I had every right to record what happened in my own house, and I wanted to know for certain who was moving my things and creating my confusion. And over the following months, those cameras captured my brother on several occasions, doing exactly what I now knew he was doing, moving my belongings, taking my glasses from where I'd left them and placing them somewhere absurd, once even turning on a stove burner and leaving it, quietly manufacturing the evidence of my decline while I was in another room, and then, minutes later, discovering it with such tender concern. I had it all. On video, my brother building his case with his own hands in my house on my cameras. He was creating the very proof that would destroy him, and he had no idea because he was certain, absolutely certain, that the man watching was too far gone to see. I want to tell you what it was like to watch that footage alone at night in my study because it was one of the hardest things I have ever done. There is a particular kind of grief in watching on a screen someone you have loved your whole life calmly and deliberately trying to destroy you. I would sit there and watch my little brother, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the man I had sat with until dawn, move through my house with a quiet purpose, opening the freezer, tucking my glasses inside, and I would see, in his face, no hesitation, no flicker of conscience, nothing but concentration, a man performing a task, and then I would watch him a few minutes later find those same glasses and turn to me with his face rearranged into perfect tender worry. Oh, Henry, they were in the freezer. Oh, this is getting worse, and the gap between those two faces, the cold working face and the warm concerned face, was the most chilling thing I have ever seen because it told me that the warm face, the one I had trusted my whole life, was a mask, had perhaps always been a mask, and that I had never really known the man underneath it at all. I wept watching that footage. I wept for the brother I thought I'd had, who it turned out had never existed, or had died somewhere along the way without my noticing. replaced by this cold, calm man in my kitchen. But I also, and I want to be honest about this, felt the case getting stronger with every clip, felt the wall getting higher, and there is a strange steadying power in that, in knowing that the very thing breaking your heart is also the thing that will save you, that your brother's betrayal, captured frame by frame, is assembling itself into your salvation. I would finish watching and dry my face and carefully label and preserve each clip, and I would think coldly, all right, Douglas, keep going, keep building my case for me, and then I would go to bed and lie awake grieving the brother in the footage, both things at once, the strategist and the heartbroken man, sharing one sleepless body. That is what this kind of fight costs, and I want you to know it, in case it is ever asked of you. Winning does not spare you the grief. You grieve and you build the wall at the same time, and you do both because you have to, and it is exhausting in a way I do not have the words for. The third thing I did was understand his motive, because a scheme needs a reason, and a court understands a scheme far better when it can see why. So, quietly, I looked into my brother's finances through entirely proper means, an investigator, a review of what was discoverable, and what I found explained everything. Douglas was ruined. A string of disastrous investments had left him buried under debts he had no way to pay, creditors closing in, his comfortable, respectable life weeks away from collapse. He was desperate, the specific kind of desperate that makes a man capable of things he would once have found unthinkable, and I understood, seeing the full picture of his ruin, that my brother had not turned into a monster overnight. He had been cornered by his own failures into becoming one, which did not excuse it, nothing excuses it, but it explained it, and more importantly, it gave the court the one thing that turns a sympathetic, concerned brother into a villain, which is a reason. A man with crushing secret debts who petitions to control his wealthy brother's fortune is not a concerned relative. He is a man with a motive, and I had documented it. And I will tell you, seeing the full extent of my brother's ruin laid out was its own strange and complicated experience, because mixed in with my anger was something I did not expect, which was a terrible sadness, almost a pity, because I could see, in the timeline of his collapse, the exact shape of a man drowning. I could see the early losses and then the frantic doubling down to recover them the way desperate men always double down, and then the larger losses and the borrowing against the borrowing, until he was so far under that no honest path could ever bring him back up. And I understood that somewhere in that spiral, my brother had looked at his situation and seen only one exit, one asset large enough to save him, which was me, or rather what I had, and that the plan to erase me had been born not out of some cartoon villainy but out of the specific, corrosive desperation of a man who has run out of every honest option and cannot face the consequences of his own failures. It did not make me forgive him. Understanding is not forgiveness, and a drowning man does not get to pull another person under to save himself. That is still murder, even if you understand why he did it. But it complicated my rage in a way I think was actually useful, because it kept me from becoming a man consumed by hatred, kept me able to see Douglas as a human being who had made monstrous choices rather than a monster, and that clarity, that refusal to let the situation turn me into something as small and desperate as he had become, was part of what let me handle the whole thing with a steady hand rather than a shaking one. You fight better, I have found, when you understand your enemy and even, in some cold corner, pity him, because pity keeps you clear, and hatred makes you stupid, and I needed, more than anything, to stay clear. I need to tell you about my daughter Claire, because she is the light in this dark story and I could not have done it without her, and because Douglas tried to use her against me and it did not work, and the reason it did not work tells you everything about the difference between them. Claire is my only child, and she lives some distance away, and in the months after Eleanor's death, Douglas had worked on her too, calling her, gently, sorrowfully, planting his seeds. Claire, I'm worried about your father. He's not himself, he's confused, he's forgetting things. I think Eleanor's death has really affected his mind. I'm doing what I can, but you should be prepared. He was trying to recruit my own daughter as a witness to my decline, to make her. When the time came, one more voice saying, poor Dad, yes, we've been so worried. And for a little while, because she loved me and was far away and frightened, Claire half believed him, and I do not blame her for that, because Douglas was very good and grief is real and she could not see what I could see. But here is where it went wrong for him. Claire came to visit. She came to see for herself because she is her mother's daughter and she was not going to accept a second-hand account of her own father's mind, and she spent a week with me, really with me, talking, doing the crossword, arguing about politics, going through Eleanor's things together and weeping and laughing, and at the end of that week she took my hand and she said, Dad, there is nothing wrong with your mind. Nothing. You're as sharp as you've ever been. Why does Uncle Douglas keep telling me you're losing it? And that was the moment I knew I would win, because the manufactured story only worked at a distance, only worked on people who took Douglas's word, and the instant anyone actually spent real time with me, the whole fiction evaporated, because I was not, in fact, impaired, and you cannot fake genuine cognition, and you cannot hide it either. I told Claire everything. Then, the whole of it, the incidents, the cameras, Dr. Nakamura, the debts, all of it, and I watched my daughter's face move from disbelief to horror to a cold fury that I recognized. Because it was Eleanor's fury, and from that moment I was not fighting alone. I had Claire beside me, and Claire became the ally who helped me spring the trap. I want to tell you about the night I told her, because it is one of the most important nights of my life. We sat at the same kitchen table where I had once sat with Douglas until dawn, and I laid it all out, calmly, in order, the way I would have presented a case to a board, and I watched Claire try, at first, to hold on to the version Douglas had given her, because it is a terrible thing to accept that your uncle is a monster, and it is almost worse to accept that you had, even for a moment, half believed him about your own father. And when I played her one of the recordings, when she saw Douglas with her own eyes take my glasses off the side table and carry them into the kitchen and tuck them inside the freezer, and then walk out with that little satisfied set to his shoulders, Claire made a sound I had not heard since her mother's funeral, and she put her hand over her mouth, and then she was not frightened anymore, she was furious, and my daughter looked up at me with Eleanor's own eyes and said, "He did this to you, while you were grieving Mom. While you were grieving Mom, Dad." And I said yes. And she said, "Then we are not just going to stop him. We are going to make sure everyone sees exactly what he is." And in that moment I understood that Eleanor had not entirely left me after all, that the clarity I had lost when she died had passed into our daughter, that the eyes that could see people truly were still in the world, still on my side, and I was not alone against my brother. I had Eleanor's fury reborn in Eleanor's daughter, and God help Douglas, because a Callaway woman who has decided you are a threat to someone she loves is the most formidable thing I have ever known. And now there was one of them aimed directly at him. Because I did not just want to survive Douglas's petition. I want to be honest with you about that. A part of me, the part that had been made to doubt my own sanity at my most grief-stricken and vulnerable, a part of me that I am not entirely proud of but will not pretend didn't exist, wanted more than survival. I wanted the trap to close on the man who said it. And so, with Claire and with a sharp elder law attorney named Dana Reyes whom I retained quietly, I made a decision that Dana initially argued against, which was that I would not move to preempt Douglas, would not expose him early, would not quietly warn him off. I would let him file. I would let him walk all the way into the courtroom, put his whole false case on the record, bring his compliant doctor, make his sorrowful speeches, commit himself totally and publicly and irreversibly to the lie, and only then, when he had staked everything on my being incompetent, would I open the wall I had built and let it fall on him. It was a risk. Dana made sure I understood the risk, that guardianship proceedings can go wrong, that judges can be persuaded, that the machinery, once started, is frightening and unpredictable. But I understood something Dana, who had not been made to doubt her own mind, could not fully feel, which was that a quiet victory would not be enough, because Douglas would simply retreat and try again another way, and because the only way to truly end this, to make myself and my autonomy permanently safe, was to expose the scheme so completely in front of a court that Douglas could never threaten me again and would answer for what he had done. So we waited. We let him build. And he did. I will not pretend the waiting was easy, because it was the hardest part of all of it, harder than the courtroom. For months I had to continue playing the part of the fading, grateful, managed old brother, had to keep smiling at Douglas's tender concern, keep letting him move my things and reschedule my appointments and perform his worry, all while knowing exactly what he was, all while every cell in my body wanted to seize him by the collar and scream that I knew. Dana, my attorney, marveled at it. She told me she had rarely seen a client with that kind of discipline, the ability to sit still inside an injustice and let it ripen, and I told her the truth, which was that it was not that I felt the injustice less than other people, it was that 30 years of business had taught me the difference between the move that feels good and the move that wins, and that I had learned, at great cost, over many years, to always choose the move that wins. But it cost me. There were nights I lay awake sick with the strain of the performance, sick with the wrongness of smiling at my own betrayer, and there were moments I nearly broke, nearly confronted him just to end the horrible daily theater of it. And in those moments it was Claire who held me steady, Claire who would remind me, when I wavered, that if we moved too soon he would simply retreat and regroup and come at me again from some new direction, that the only way to truly end it was to let him commit completely and then bring the whole thing down at once, in the light, on the record, in a way he could never recover from. My daughter became my discipline in those months, the steadying hand on my arm that kept me from throwing away a year of careful work for one moment of satisfaction. And I have thought since that this, too, was Eleanor's gift reaching me through our daughter, because Eleanor was always the one who could keep me from the rash move, the one who would put her hand on mine at a dinner and keep me from saying the thing I would regret, and now that hand was Claire's, and it kept me on the road all the way to the courtroom. If you have made it this far, let me ask you the question I sat with in the long months of waiting, because it is not a simple one and I genuinely want to know where you land. When someone betrays you and you catch them and you hold the proof in your hands, is it enough to simply protect yourself, to block them, to walk away safe? Or is there a point at which allowing a betrayer to fail quietly, with no consequence, no exposure, is its own kind of failure, because it leaves them free to do it again, to you or to someone else weaker than you? I chose exposure. I chose to let my brother commit fully and then to bring the whole truth down on him in the light of a courtroom. And I have asked myself many times since whether that was justice or whether it was something closer to vengeance wearing justice's clothes. Tell me in the comments what you would have done, because I think the line between protecting yourself and punishing the one who wronged you is one of the hardest lines there is to find, and I am not certain even now that I found it in exactly the right place. Stay with me, because Douglas filed his petition, and the day came, and I walked into that courtroom carrying a year of proof to watch my brother try to erase me. The petition, when it came, was a masterpiece of weaponized concern, and I read every word of it with Dana at my side. And I will tell you, it was a strange thing to read a document, written by your own brother, describing you as a confused, declining, vulnerable man incapable of managing your own affairs, listing every manufactured incident as evidence. The glasses, the appointments, the stove, the money, all of it presented as the tragic symptoms of a mind in decline, all of it requiring, so sorrowfully, that control of my person and my estate be given to my loving, responsible younger brother, for my own protection. It was obscene, and it was, I had to admit, well made, because every piece of manufactured evidence looked, on paper, exactly like what it was pretending to be, and if I had not had my wall, if I had walked into that courtroom with nothing but my insistence that I was fine, I might well have lost, because the document was persuasive and the machinery was tilted, and a grieving widower protesting his own sanity is the easiest thing in the world to disbelieve. Douglas had a doctor, too, a Dr. Colton, who had examined me exactly once, briefly, in a visit Douglas had arranged under the guise of a routine checkup, and who was prepared to testify that he had concerns about my cognition, concerns based, I would establish, almost entirely on the history Douglas had provided him rather than on any real examination. I remember that visit now, in light of everything, and I understand how thoroughly it was staged. Douglas had told me it was just a routine wellness check, nothing to worry about, and he had come with me into the room, which I thought at the time was thoughtful, and had done most of the talking, which I also thought at the time was just Douglas being Douglas, and I understand now that every bit of it was choreography. Douglas sat in that room and, in front of me, narrated a version of my life to the doctor. Oh, he's been so forgetful, doctor. He left the stove on last week. He gets confused about his appointments. He's not been himself since his wife passed, painting the whole false picture while I sat there. And I, still half inside the fog then, still half believing it myself, did not contradict him, and Dr. Colton, who was not a bad man exactly but a careless and incurious one, took Douglas's narration as fact and asked me a few cursory questions and wrote down his concerns, never suspecting that he was being used as a prop, that the entire visit had been arranged not to assess my health but to manufacture a medical record, a doctor's note that could later be waived in a courtroom. That is how these schemes recruit their professionals, I have learned, not usually through outright corruption but through the exploitation of busy, incurious people who will accept a plausible family member's account rather than do the hard work of a real independent examination. And it is why, when Dana put Dr. Colton on the stand beside Dr. Nakamura's rigorous year of testing, he simply crumbled because he had built his opinion on sand, on Douglas's words, and Dr. Nakamura had built hers on bedrock, on data, and a courtroom can tell the difference between the two the moment they are placed side by side. Douglas had built his case out of a year of patient manufacture, and he walked into that courtroom confident, sorrowful, respectable, the very picture of a good man doing a hard and loving thing, and he had no idea, none, that he was walking into a trap. I let him go first. That was the plan, and it was the right one. I sat quietly, the picture of a calm, dignified old man, while Douglas and his lawyer presented their case. while Dr. Colton offered his careful concerns, while my brother took the stand and spoke, with tears in his eyes, tears, about how painful this was, how much he loved me, how he only wanted to protect his dear brother from the cruel decline that had taken hold since Eleanor's death. I watched the judge listen. I watched the sympathy build in the room, the sad nodding, the sense settling over everyone that this was a tragedy, that poor Henry Calloway was slipping away and his good brother was doing the responsible thing. There is a specific horror in watching someone perform grief and love about you, to your face in order to destroy you, and I sat through it that morning, and I want to tell you it took everything I had built over 30 years to keep my face still. Because Douglas was good. I have to give the devil that. He sat in that witness box and he let his voice break at exactly the right moments, and he dabbed at his eyes, and he spoke about our childhood, about how I had always looked after him, about how it broke his heart to see the strong older brother he had always admired reduced to confusion, about how the hardest thing he had ever done was come to this court, but that love sometimes means doing the hard thing, means protecting someone even when they cannot understand that they need protecting. It was a masterful performance, and the terrible thing, the thing that turned my stomach, was that I could see, threaded through it, the real memories, the real childhood, the real history between us, all of it twisted and put in service of the lie, so that his performance was not built out of nothing but out of the actual love we had once had, weaponized. He was using our real past as the raw material for my erasure, and I sat there and watched him do it, and I understood that this was perhaps the most intimate betrayal possible, to take the true history of a bond and reforge it into the instrument of destroying the person you shared it with. I kept my face still. I had promised myself I would give that courtroom nothing to read as instability, and so I sat, calm and quiet and dignified, and let my brother weep his false tears, and I waited because I knew something he did not, which was that in a little while it would be my turn, and that when it was, I would not need to weep or perform anything at all. I would only need to open the wall. I let it build. I let Douglas climb all the way to the top of the story he had constructed, commit to it completely, stake his entire reputation and his petition on the claim that I was incompetent. And then Dana stood up, and it was our turn, and I watched my brother's confident, sorrowful face across that courtroom as the wall I had spent a year building began, piece by piece, to come down on him. Dana began with Dr. Nakamura. She called the most respected neuropsychologist in the region to the stand, and Dr. Nakamura presented her findings, 3 full evaluations over the course of the year, dated, rigorous, unimpeachable, establishing that Henry Calloway's cognition was not merely intact but exceptional, in the top percentiles for his age, that there was no evidence whatsoever of decline, dementia, or impairment of any kind, and that she would stake her professional reputation on the conclusion that I was entirely, completely competent to manage every aspect of my own affairs. And I watched the room shift. I watched the sad certainty that had settled over everyone begin to crack, because here was real evidence, real data, from a source no one could dismiss, and it said, in the clearest possible terms, that the entire premise of Douglas's petition was false. Dr. Colton, who had examined me once for 20 minutes, suddenly looked very small next to Dr. Nakamura's year of rigorous testing, and under Dana's questioning he was forced to admit that his concerns were based largely on the history Douglas had given him, that he had not conducted anything like a thorough evaluation, that he could not, in fact, in the face of Dr. Nakamura's findings, stand behind a diagnosis of incompetence. The medical foundation of Douglas's case collapsed in the space of an hour, and then Dana brought the trap fully closed, because it was not enough to prove I was sane. I wanted the court to understand why a sane man had been dragged into that room, and so Dana presented the rest of it, the wall behind the wall. She presented my journal, the meticulous documentation of every manufactured incident. And then she presented the recordings. In a courtroom gone completely silent, we played the footage from my own home, legally obtained, of Douglas moving my belongings, taking my glasses and hiding them, turning on the stove burner and walking away, manufacturing with his own hands on video the very evidence he had just presented to the court as proof of my decline. I watched my brother's face as the footage played. I watched the tears dry up. I watched the sorrowful, concerned mask fall away completely, because there is no explaining away a video of yourself hiding your brother's glasses to make him seem demented. There is no story that survives that, and the room that had, an hour earlier, been full of sympathy for poor responsible Douglas, was now looking at him with a dawning, cold horror. And then Dana presented the motive, the documented evidence of Douglas's catastrophic secret debts, his ruin, his desperate need for control of exactly the fortune his petition would have handed him, and the picture was complete, and it was undeniable, and it was devastating. The concerned brother was revealed, in the space of a single afternoon, as a desperate, ruined man who had spent a year gaslighting his own grieving brother and manufacturing false evidence in order to seize his fortune through the machinery of a court. And I sat there, calm, sane, vindicated, and watched the trap I had built close completely around the man who had tried to erase me. And then I did the one thing I had wanted to do for a year, the thing that mattered most to me of all of it. I asked to speak. Dana had prepared me, had warned me that I did not need to, that the case was already won, that sometimes the alleged incapacitated person testifying is a risk. But I told her there was no risk because I was not going to argue that I was competent. I was simply going to be competent in front of everyone, out loud, and let them watch. And I took the stand, an old man that a courtroom had spent a morning being told was losing his mind. And I spoke, without notes, clearly and precisely, for some time. I laid out the entire architecture of what my brother had done in order, with dates, with reasoning, connecting every piece, the grief he exploited, the isolation he engineered, the incidents he manufactured, the doctor he misled, the debts that drove him, the petition that was meant to be the final stroke. I spoke the way I had once addressed boardrooms, the way a man speaks who has spent his life building and selling companies and understanding how things actually work. And as I spoke, I watched the last trace of doubt leave that courtroom, because you cannot listen to a man reason like that, remember like that, connect like that, and go on believing he has lost his mind. My competence was not something Dr. Nakamura had to certify in the end, though her certification was the wall that made it safe. My competence was something the whole room simply watched, in real time as I dismantled, with a clear and unhurried mind, the fiction that I had no mind left. And when I finished, I looked directly at my brother, for the first time really looking at him since it all began. And I said, not with rage but quietly, so the whole room could hear, "Douglas, you told them I couldn't think anymore. I've just spent 20 minutes thinking, in front of all of them. Was there any part of that you couldn't follow?" And Douglas could not answer, could not look at me, and the silence in that courtroom was the sound of his entire scheme finishing its collapse. That was the moment. Not the video, not the evaluations, though those won the case. The moment that mattered to me, the moment I had wanted for a year, was simply being allowed to stand up and be, undeniably out loud, in front of everyone who had been told otherwise myself. Let me tell you how it ended, and then let me tell you the one thing I most need you to carry. The judge did not take long. The petition was dismissed, completely, with a finding on the record that I was fully competent and that the proceeding had been an abuse of the guardianship system, brought in bad faith. But the judge did more than dismiss it, because what the courtroom had seen was not merely a weak case, it was evidence of a deliberate scheme of manufactured evidence, of what the law recognizes as elder abuse and abusive process, and the judge referred the matter for exactly that. Douglas did not simply lose his petition. He walked out of that courtroom a man facing serious legal consequences for what he had done. His reputation destroyed in front of everyone whose opinion he had spent his life cultivating. His desperate scheme not only failed but transformed, by his own hand and his own recorded actions, into the instrument of his ruin. And I pursued it. I want to be honest about that. I did not let it go out of brotherly softness. I let the referral proceed because a man who will manufacture madness in his own grieving brother to steal a fortune is a man who will do it again to someone else, someone who might not have the resources or the foresight to build a wall, and I decided that protecting those future victims, whoever they might be, mattered more than protecting my brother from the consequences of his own choices. Douglas made his bed in a courtroom, with his own recorded hands, and I let him lie in it, but I did not destroy him beyond what justice required, and I want to tell you about the one mercy I extended, because it matters. When it was all over, when the legal consequences were underway, Douglas came to me, a broken man, and he did not really apologize because men like Douglas cannot quite manage a true apology. But he asked, humbled and desperate, whether I would help him with the crushing debts that had driven him to it, the debts that were now, with his reputation gone, going to swallow him entirely. And I thought about it for a long time. And in the end I did help him, not fully, not in a way that erased the consequences of what he'd done, but enough to keep him from utter destitution, enough to keep my brother off the street, and I did it not for his sake but for mine, and for the memory of our parents, and because I had decided long before that courtroom that I would not let what Douglas did to me turn me into a version of Douglas. A man who lets another human being be destroyed when he has the power to prevent it. I helped him because refusing would have cost me something I valued more than the satisfaction of his ruin, which was my own sense of who I am. But I helped him from a distance, through lawyers, and I have not spoken to my brother since that day, and I do not expect to again, and that estrangement is a grief I carry. The loss of the little brother I spent a lifetime catching. But it is a clean grief now, the grief of a man who did everything right and was betrayed anyway, and that is a far lighter thing to carry than the grief of a man who let himself be erased. I want to tell you where I went the day it ended, the day I walked out of that courtroom a free and vindicated man, because it tells you what the whole thing had really been about. I did not go home and I did not go celebrate. I drove to the cemetery, and I sat down on the grass beside Eleanor's grave, in the late afternoon light, and I told her everything. I told her what her brother-in-law had tried to do, and I told her how I had fought it, and I told her that our daughter had been magnificent, had been exactly her mother reborn, clear-eyed and fierce and unbreakable, and I sat there and I wept, but they were not the weak, dissolving tears of those terrible early weeks. They were clean tears, the tears of a man who had been to the edge of losing himself and had come all the way back. And I said to her, out loud, to the grass and the stone and the memory of 46 years, Eleanor, they tried to tell the world I'd lost my mind, and I didn't. I held on to it, I held on to myself, the way you always told me to, and I understood, sitting there, that in some strange way the whole ordeal had been a final gift from her, because the discipline that saved me, the clarity, the refusal to panic, the instinct to document and wait, all of it was, in the end, the marriage itself. 46 years of Eleanor teaching me to think clearly and see people truly, still working in me, still guarding me after she was gone. Douglas thought that, with Eleanor dead, I was undefended. He never understood that a good marriage does not end when one person dies, that everything she was becomes part of what you are, and that in trying to erase me he had run headlong into 46 years of Eleanor, still standing, invisible, between me and the dark. I sat by her grave until the light was gone, and then I got up, an old man with his mind fully his own, and I drove home to my life, the whole of it intact, mine. My daughter Claire and I are closer now than we have ever been, forged in that fire, and she tells me she is proud of me, proud of how I fought, and there is no evaluation from any specialist, no finding from any judge, that means as much to me as my daughter's certainty that her father's mind is his own. And I have my life back, all of it, my autonomy, my dignity, my freedom to make my own decisions well and badly and to answer to no one, which is the birthright of every competent adult and which I will never again take for granted, because I know now, in a way most people are lucky enough never to learn, exactly how fragile it is and exactly how precious. I think often now about how many people are living inside some version of what happened to me, and are not as lucky as I was, did not have the resources to hire Dr. Nakamura and Dana Reyes, did not have a daughter with her mother's clear eyes, did not have 30 years of business instinct to reach back into. I think about the old people, especially all over the world, who are quietly being erased right now by relatives who have discovered that the easiest way to take everything a person has is to declare that the person is no longer really there. Because that is the particular terror of growing old, is it not? The fear that at some point the world will stop seeing you as a full person, will start talking about you instead of to you, will begin to treat your preferences as symptoms and your objections as confusion, and that once that starts, once you have been recategorized in people's minds from person to patient, from adult to burden, it can be almost impossible to climb back out, because every protest is heard as further evidence. I was nearly recategorized like that, permanently, by a court, and I climbed back out only because I saw it coming and had the means to fight, and I am haunted by the knowledge of how many people don't, how many are sitting in managed silence right now while someone who claims to love them quietly dismantles their standing as a human being. If the story reaches even one of them or one person who loves one of them, and gives them the idea that saved me, get the independent evaluation, document everything, understand the motive, do not merely protest but prove, then the whole ordeal will have been worth telling, because the thing I most want is for no one else to be erased who does not have to be. My name is Henry Calloway, and here is the one thing I most need you to carry, and I want to say it carefully because it is easy to take the wrong lesson from a story like mine. The lesson is not that guardianship is evil, or that families cannot be trusted, or that we should tear down the systems that protect vulnerable people. Because here is a truth I insisted on holding on to even in the depths of my own rage, even when the system was being used as a weapon against me. That same system, most of the time, protects people who genuinely need protecting, people whose minds truly are failing, people who would be preyed upon by the world without a guardian to shield them, and that protection is a good and necessary and humane thing, and the existence of people like Douglas, who abuse it must never become an excuse to deny it to the millions who truly need it. Real cognitive decline is real. Real vulnerability is real. And the answer to the abuse of a protective system is not to destroy the system. It is to build in the safeguards that catch the abusers, the independent evaluations, the scrutiny of motive, the requirement of real proof, the exact things that saved me. So do not take from my story a contempt for guardianship. Take from it a vigilance about its abuse. The real lesson, the one I need you to carry, is about the thing my brother tried to take, which was not my money in the end, but my very self, my standing as a person whose perceptions and decisions and mind are my own. That is the most valuable thing any of us possesses, more valuable than any fortune, the simple sovereignty of being trusted to be the author of your own life. And it is a thing that can be attacked quietly by people who wrap the attack in the language of love and concern. And if it ever happens to you, I need you to know 3 things. Know that being made to doubt your own mind is a real and specific form of cruelty, and that if someone you trust keeps gently telling you that you cannot trust yourself, that is not always love, and you are allowed to question it. Know that you cannot win a war over your own competence by protesting, only by proof, and that the proof is available, independent, credible, documented proof, and that seeking it is not paranoia, it is wisdom. And know, above all, that being underestimated, being declared finished, being told by the people around you that you are not what you know yourself to be, is not the same as being finished, and that some of the strongest things a person ever does are done by someone the world had already written off, quietly building a wall while everyone assumed there was no one home to build it. So let me leave you with the question I have carried since I walked out of that courtroom, a free and vindicated man, and let me ask it plainly. If the people who were supposed to love and protect you instead decided to declare you incapable, to erase you, to take your very self through the machinery meant to shelter the vulnerable, how would you fight back? Would you rage and protest and insist? Or would you do the harder, colder, wiser thing and go quietly build the wall of proof that no lie can climb? And when you had won, when you held the power to destroy the one who tried to erase you, would you use all of it? Or would you stop at the line where justice ends and cruelty begins? Tell me in the comments, because I think there are more people living in the shadow of this particular fear than anyone knows. Aging parents afraid of their own children, people watching a relative circle of vulnerable loved one, people who have been made, by someone they trusted, to doubt their own grip on the world, and they need to hear tonight that a sane mind, quietly defended with proof and dignity, is a fortress that the cruelest scheme cannot take. They tried to declare me unfit. They tried to tell the world I was gone while I was standing right there. And the sane man, the one they had all written off, turned out to be holding the only thing that mattered, which was the truth, patiently documented, waiting for its day in the light. Guard your mind. It is the last thing they should ever be allowed to take, and the one thing, if you defend it wisely, that they never can.